Hey everyone, welcome back to a special journey into the world of gemstones. But today we're not talking about jewelry. We're talking about gemstones as something the wealthy use to protect money when inflation rises. Because here's the truth. When cash loses value, you don't need to take wild risks. You just need to stop storing money in the wrong place. Today we're counting down 10 gemstones that became more valuable during inflation. Not because they got prettier, but because they held something paper money started losing: trust. And the number one gemstone on this list is not a diamond, not a ruby. And it's definitely not what you think. I won't tell you the price yet, but it's high enough to make people invest wrong purely out of emotion. If you feel like this is the start of something new, leave a comment saying, "I like this video," so I know you're with me on this journey. Stay until the end to see the number one gemstone, because there's a real chance you already own one. And don't forget to subscribe. If you're busy right now, save this video, because this is a fascinating journey through gemstones you've probably misunderstood for years. All right, let's start. And I need you to understand this before we go any further. If you think the safe gemstones during inflation are automatically the most famous ones, you're exactly the kind of buyer the market profits from. Because inflation doesn't reward reputation first. It rewards what can still be sold when people stop trusting cash. That's why number 10 is going to sound almost ridiculous. Most people will hear it and think, that's not a real asset. And that reaction is precisely why it belongs on this list. So let's begin with the stone that looks cheap, but behaves like a cash shelter. Top 10, Smoky Quartz. The cheap stone that behaves like an asset. If you're holding cash right now, I'm going to be blunt. You're not standing still. You're moving backward. Inflation doesn't have to explode to be dangerous. At just 6 to 10% a year, you're already losing purchasing power. Quietly. And the scariest part is this. The money is still there, but its value is being drained day by day. That's why in every inflation cycle, wealthy people don't ask, is cash safe? They ask, which assets still hold trust when money loses value? And today I'm starting this top 10 list with a choice that might annoy some people. Smoky Quartz. Not because it's rare, not because it's expensive, but because it behaves like something the market always needs during instability. A small, portable asset that's easy to buy, easy to sell, and not dependent on the financial system. In finance, we call that a low-friction asset. Something you can move quickly, without long explanations, and without being locked into a single platform. Smoky Quartz does exactly that in the lower price range, which is why most people overlook it. In terms of color, Smoky Quartz is a form of quartz with tones like smoky brown, charcoal gray, and sometimes a deep tea black. It's not flashy like ruby, but it has a powerful advantage during inflation. It looks serious, mature, and heavy. The most resale-friendly cuts are Opal, the easiest to sell; Cushion, luxury feel; Emerald cut makes it look more expensive than it is. Here's the key. Smoky Quartz looks best when it's clean, high clarity, even tone, and sharply faceted. Now let's talk about what you actually care about: price. Commercial Smoky Quartz often sells around $10 to $60 per carat. High-quality stones, deep tone, high clarity, strong cut, can reach $80 to $200 per carat, depending on the market. It still sounds cheap, right? But this is where most people misunderstand asset accumulation. During inflation, billionaires don't only buy the most expensive thing. They buy in 3 layers. 1. Core hedges, gold, real estate, blue-chip assets. 2. System-resistant assets, portable wealth, easy to move. 3. Community liquidity assets, gemstones, watches, small art. Smoky Quartz sits in layer 3, but as a surprisingly smart entry asset, because it lets you enter the gemstone world without paying an expensive tuition fee. Let me be clear, Smoky Quartz won't make you a millionaire, but it teaches you something more important. During inflation, what protects money isn't the rarest asset. It's the asset that other people still trust as convertible into value. And now I want to ask you a question, because I want real debate in the comments. In 2026, Which gemstone do you think will be the safest place for cash? Ruby, sapphire, emerald, or something the market is still undervaluing? So that was Smoky Quartz. And if you still think that stone is too cheap to matter, good. Because that mindset is exactly why most people lose money in inflation. They ignore the stones that move first, and they only pay attention when the price is already gone. Now we move to number 9. This is the gemstone that gets dismissed as a bargain bin red stone until buyers realize something uncomfortable. The best garnets don't look cheap. They look like a substitute for ruby. And in inflation, substitutes are where the money runs when the real thing becomes unaffordable. Top 9 Garnet, the underrated gem that wins when budgets break. Most people hear the word garnet, and they instantly file it under cheap gemstone. And that's exactly why it belongs in this list. Because during inflation, the best performing assets aren't always the most glamorous. They're often the ones the public misunderstands, until demand quietly builds underneath them. Garnet is one of the most financially underrated gemstones in the entire market. Not because it's rare in the geological sense, but because the best garnets don't behave like cheap stones at all. Here's what inflation does to buyers. It splits the market in two. At the top, wealthy buyers run toward classic hard assets. At the bottom, everyday people still want something real, something physical, something that doesn't feel like paper. That middle zone is where garnet thrives, because garnet has 3 advantages that matter in inflation. First, it's durable. Most garnets sit around 6.5 to 7.5 on the Mohs scale, which makes them practical for jewelry. And that matters. If a stone can't survive daily wear, resale becomes harder. Second, it looks expensive. Deep red garnet, especially well cut, can look shockingly close to ruby under indoor lighting. That's not a scam. That's market psychology. In unstable times, people pay for the feeling of value as much as the value itself. And third, the supply is misleading. Most garnet on the market is commercial grade. But the top-tier material, the kind collectors and serious buyers chase, is a completely different story. If you want the garnets that actually move during inflation, you look for rhodolite, a rich raspberry red with violet undertones; spessartite, the vivid orange mandarin garnet; savorite, a green garnet that can rival emerald in impact. Those 3 categories are where the price behavior changes, because now you're no longer buying garnet. You're buying a gemstone with its own micro market. Now let's talk about cuts and shapes, because this is where liquidity lives. The most resale-friendly garnet shapes are oval, cushion, round, and occasionally pear. Why? Because these shapes fit mainstream jewelry settings, and mainstream settings are what create buyers during uncertain times. In terms of pricing, garnet is one of the few gemstones where you can still find $20 to $80 per carat for decent material, $100 to $400 per carat for high-grade rhodolite, spessartite, $500 to $2,000 plus per carat for topped savorite or exceptional spessartite. And here's the financial reason garnet matters. During inflation, people don't just buy luxury, they buy liquid beauty, something real, tradable, and emotionally satisfying. Garnet sits in that sweet spot. It's affordable enough for many buyers to enter, but strong enough in appearance to feel like a serious asset. And if you think that's irrelevant, remember this: markets are not driven by rarity. They're driven by belief plus demand plus resale behavior. So here's my question for you, and I want you to answer honestly. If inflation stays high through 2026, which gemstone do you trust more as a safe place for cash? Garnet? Or do you think the real safety is only in the big 3, ruby, sapphire, and emerald? So that's garnet, a stone that proves something brutal about inflation. When prices break, the market doesn't stop buying. It starts hunting for substitutes. But number 8 is different, because this time, the danger isn't price. The danger is that most people don't even know what they're buying. And during inflation, that mistake is expensive. Because citrine is one of the few gemstones where the word natural can change everything. And most of the market is built on stones that aren't. Top 8, citrine, the stone most people buy wrong. Citrine is one of the most dangerous gemstones to buy during inflation. Not because it's volatile, not because it's fragile, but because most of what the market calls citrine isn't actually citrine. And in inflation, that one detail becomes financially lethal. Because when money loses value, people don't just want something beautiful. They want something they can convert back into money later. And resale depends on one thing more than color, more than size, more than sparkle: trust. Here's the truth that the jewelry industry rarely says out loud. The majority of citrine sold globally is heat-treated amethyst. It's real quartz? Yes, but it's not natural citrine. It's amethyst that's been heated until the purple breaks and the crystal turns yellow to orange. And here's why that matters financially. Natural citrine is relatively uncommon in clean, strong color. Heat-treated amethyst is everywhere. So when inflation rises and buyers start getting cautious, they stop asking, "Does it look good?" And they start asking, "What is it exactly?" That's when the market splits. On one side, mass citrine, cheap, abundant, and emotionally driven. On the other side, certified natural citrine. Smaller market, but a market that holds value. Now visually, here's how you understand the difference. Natural citrine usually has a tone that looks like pale champagne, light honey, soft golden straw. Rarely aggressive orange. Heat-treated material often looks like burnt orange, deep amber, sometimes with reddish, scorched edges. It's louder, more dramatic. And ironically, that's why it sells. But resale is where it collapses. Because in the gemstone world, the most expensive thing isn't rarity, it's credibility. And citrine has a credibility problem. So if you're thinking like a financial buyer, not an impulse buyer, here's what matters. 1. Clarity. Natural citrine is usually clean, but the best stones have a glassy clarity that looks high-end. 2. Cut. The most liquid shapes are oval, cushion, emerald cut because they fit classic rings and pendants. 3. Certification/disclosure. If you want citrine to behave like an asset, you need either a trusted seller reputation or documentation, especially for larger stones. Now pricing, most commercial citrine sits around $5 to $30 per carat. High quality, well-cut stones can reach $40 to $120 per carat. And true natural citrine, clean, balanced color, larger sizes, can push into $150 to $400 per carat in certain markets. Not because it's magical, but because it's one of the rare cases where the word natural actually changes the entire financial equation. Here's the takeaway. During inflation, you should not keep money sitting still, but you also shouldn't throw money into assets you can't explain later. Because when inflation ends, what survives isn't the stone. It's the story people still believe. So I'll end with a question, and I want your real opinion. In 2026, do you think the safer play is a beautiful stone or a provable stone? So that was citrine. And citrine teaches one brutal rule of inflation. It's not the stone that destroys your money, it's the part of the story you can't prove. Now we move to number 7, because turquoise takes that same problem and turns it into an entire battlefield. Treatments, stabilization, dye, provenance, old mines. With turquoise, 2 stones can look identical, and one can be worth 10 times more than the other. And in inflation, that gap gets wider. Top 7, turquoise. The treatment trap that splits the market. Turquoise is one of the strangest inflation assets on earth. Because unlike ruby or sapphire, turquoise doesn't win by being perfect. It wins by being believed in. And during inflation, belief is not a soft factor. It's a financial force. Here's what most people don't realize. Turquoise is not one market. It's 2 completely different markets pretending to be one. Market number 1 is commercial turquoise, dyed, stabilized, and mass-produced. Market number 2 is natural, old mine turquoise, limited supply, historically respected, and aggressively collected. And in inflation, those 2 worlds separate fast. Because when money gets tight, buyers become brutal. They stop paying for color alone. They start paying for authenticity. Now let's define the problem. Turquoise is a porous gemstone. In its natural state, much of it is too soft to survive jewelry wear. So the industry stabilizes it, usually by impregnating it with resin. That doesn't automatically make it fake, but it changes one thing that matters more than anything in inflation: resale trust. If you want turquoise to behave like an asset, you're not buying blue, you're buying provenance. That's why the most valuable turquoise isn't always the brightest. It's the turquoise that can be tied to an old mine, a known region, a recognized trading network, and a buyer community that actually understands it. And yeah, that sounds like a cultural story, but financially it's liquidity. Now visually, here's what separates the two categories. Commercial stabilized turquoise often looks perfectly uniform, extremely bright, almost paint-like, sometimes with matrix patterns that look too consistent. Natural turquoise tends to show slight color variation, more depth in tone, a surface that feels mineral, not plastic, matrix that looks organic, not designed. And this matters because during inflation, the buyer mindset changes. They're not buying to decorate, they're buying to store value in something physical. Now let's talk about how wealthy collectors treat turquoise. Serious buyers don't buy turquoise like they buy diamonds. They buy it like they buy rare coins, vintage watches, or art, meaning they look for pieces that have a story they can resell. The strongest turquoise categories in the market are Sleeping Beauty, historically famous, even after the mine closure; Bisbee, deep blue with high collector demand; Persian/Iranian turquoise, cultural authority, long history; Lander blue, extreme scarcity and high-grade material. And when inflation rises, those names matter, because names are shortcuts for trust. In terms of pricing, turquoise is one of the wildest gemstones. Commercial stabilized material can be $1 to $10 per carat. Decent natural turquoise might sit around $20 to $80 per carat. High-grade old mine turquoise can reach $200 to $1,000 plus per carat. And exceptional collector-grade pieces can go even higher. So here's the financial lesson. Turquoise is not valuable because it's rare. It's valuable because the market has memory. And inflation is when market memory becomes a weapon. Because when people lose trust in currency, they move toward things that already have trust built in. So here's my question for you, and I want a real argument in the comments. If you had to store value for 12 months during inflation, would you trust natural turquoise? Or would you avoid it completely because of treatments? Top 6, Opal. Beautiful, valuable, and easy to buy incorrectly. Opal is one of the most misunderstood inflation gemstones in the world because opal doesn't behave like ruby, it doesn't behave like sapphire, and it definitely doesn't behave like gold. Opal behaves like a market mood, and in inflation, mood becomes money. Here's why opal rises during unstable economic cycles. When people feel their cash losing value, they don't only buy assets, they buy emotionally convincing objects, things that feel rare, personal, and impossible to replicate, and nothing does that better than opal. That moving fire, that shifting color, that alive effect. But here's the financial trap. Most people buy opal incorrectly. They think they're buying a gemstone. What they're actually buying is a structure. Because opal comes in 3 major forms: solid opal, one piece of natural opal material; doublet, a thin slice of opal glued to a backing; triplet, opal slice plus backing plus a clear dome cap on top. All 3 can look stunning, but only one behaves like an asset: solid opal. And during inflation, that distinction matters more than the color. Because when you try to resell an opal, buyers don't ask you, is it pretty? They ask, is it solid? If the answer is no, your resale price collapses. Now, why does this matter specifically in inflation? Because inflation forces the market into verification mode. Buyers become suspicious, sellers get aggressive, and anything with complexity or hidden construction gets punished. That's why doublets and triplets, even when beautiful, don't hold value the same way. Now let's talk about what wealthy buyers actually chase. The strongest opal categories in the high-end market are black opal, especially from Lightning Ridge; bolder opal, dramatic patterns, natural ironstone backing; Crystal opal, transparent body with strong color play. The reason these win in inflation is simple. They're recognizable, they're emotionally powerful, and the top-tier supply is genuinely limited. Now visually, here's what a financially correct opal looks like. The color play is strong even in low light. The pattern is clean and distinct. The body tone is stable, not cloudy, not milky unless it's intentional. The stone is thick enough to prove it's solid, and the polish looks mineral, not plastic. The best shapes for resale are usually oval, freeform, especially for bolder opal, and occasionally cushion rounds exist, but opal is rarely at its best in round cuts. Now pricing, and this is where opal gets serious. Commercial opal can be $10 to $50 per carat. Solid opal with strong play of color often sits around $100 to $800 per carat. High-grade black opal can climb to $2,000 to $10,000 plus per carat, and in exceptional stones far beyond that. So here's the financial conclusion. Opal is not a safe inflation asset because it's stable. It's a safe inflation asset because it's desired. And desire is a currency, but only if you buy the right form. Solid, not assembled. So here's my question for you, and I want a real answer. If you had to store cash for 1 year, would you trust opal, knowing how easily people buy the wrong kind? Top 5, Spinel, the luxury substitute that explodes during inflation. Spinel is what happens when inflation breaks the gemstone market, because when prices surge, the market doesn't stop buying. It substitutes. That's a core rule in economics. When something becomes too expensive, demand doesn't vanish. It migrates. And Spinel is one of the clearest examples of that migration. For decades, Spinel lived in ruby's shadow. In fact, historically, some of the most famous rubies in royal collections were later identified as Spinel. But in inflation, Spinel stops being a mistake. It becomes a strategy. Here's why. When inflation rises, two things happen at the same time. First, top-tier ruby and sapphire prices accelerate. Not gradually, aggressively, because wealthy buyers treat them like portable hard assets. Second, the mid-market gets squeezed. People still want a serious gemstone, but they can't justify paying the new premium. That's where Spinel wins, because Spinel offers something financially rare, a luxury look, with a price that still has room to run. Now, Spinel isn't one stone, it's a spectrum. The most valuable Spinel colors are vivid red, ruby-like, but often cleaner. Hot pink, high demand, modern luxury. Cobalt blue, extremely rare and aggressively priced. Fine lavender/purple, strong collector niche. And unlike some gemstones, Spinel often comes with a major advantage. It can be untreated. No heating, no filling, no oiling. That matters in inflation because the market becomes allergic to uncertainty. Buyers don't want maybe, they want clean disclosure. Now let's talk about the shapes and cuts that actually move. The most liquid spinel cuts are oval, cushion, and round. Cushion cuts dominate the premium market because they maximize color depth and give the stone that classic high jewelry look. And clarity matters more than people expect. A high-grade red Spinel can look cleaner than ruby because ruby often carries inclusions. That means Spinel sometimes looks more expensive than ruby even when it's priced lower. Now let's talk pricing. Commercial Spinel can still be found around $50 to $300 per carat, but fine quality Spinel quickly jumps into $500 to $2,500 per carat. In top-tier material, especially vivid red or cobalt blue, can reach $5,000 to $15,000 plus per carat, depending on origin, certification, and demand. So why does Spinel belong in an inflation list? Because Spinel is a pressure valve. When the market overheats, people still need a gemstone that signals wealth and stability. Spinel is one of the few stones that can do that without requiring the buyer to enter the extreme ruby and sapphire price tier. And here's the most important financial point. Spinel doesn't win because it's the rarest stone. It wins because it's the most logical substitute when the premium market becomes unaffordable. Inflation doesn't just raise prices, it reshapes what people consider worth it. And Spinel is one of the biggest winners of that reshaping. So here's my question for you. And I want a real debate. If ruby becomes too expensive for most buyers, do you think Spinel becomes the next store of value gemstone? Or will the market always treat it as second place? Top 4, Sapphire, the unheated premium that holds trust. If inflation is a fire, Sapphire is one of the oldest vaults people run toward. Not because Sapphire is trendy, not because it's rare in a scientific sense, but because Sapphire is one of the few gemstones the global market already knows how to trust. And in inflation, trust is not a feeling, it's a pricing mechanism. Here's the key idea. When cash weakens, the market shifts from beauty buying to proof buying. People stop paying for what looks good. They start paying for what can be defended. That's exactly where Sapphire dominates, especially unheated Sapphire. Because Sapphire has something most gemstones never achieve, a universal reputation. If you show Sapphire to a buyer in New York, Dubai, Hong Kong, or Geneva, they may argue about price, but they won't argue about what it is. That matters for liquidity. Now, the moment you add one phrase, unheated, the market changes. Because heating is common in Sapphire, it's accepted. It's not always bad, but in inflation, buyers become more conservative. They don't want a stone that needs explanation. They want the version of the stone that feels closest to original. Unheated Sapphire becomes the financial equivalent of a first edition, a factory original vintage watch, or an unaltered classic car. It's not always the most beautiful, but it's the most defensible. Now let's talk about color, because Sapphire is not one market. The highest demand Sapphire colors tend to be royal blue, cornflower blue, vivid blue with strong saturation, and increasingly pad Paraiba, pink orange, extremely premium. But the inflation winners are usually blue sapphires because blue has the strongest global recognition. Shape also matters more than people think. The most liquid sapphire cuts are oval, cushion, round. Emerald cuts exist, but sapphire often performs best when the cut maximizes depth and saturation. Now pricing, heated sapphire can range widely, but unheated sapphire is where the market gets serious. You can see from $300 to $1,500 per carat for smaller unheated stones with decent color, $2,000 to $8,000 per carat for strong color, good clarity, and certification. $10,000 to $50,000 plus per carat for top-tier unheated sapphire in larger sizes. And in inflation, those top stones behave less like jewelry and more like portable wealth, because they sit in a category that wealthy buyers understand, a compact asset with global resale channels. Now here's the part most people miss. Sapphire doesn't spike the way meme assets spike. It doesn't explode overnight. Instead, sapphire climbs with something more powerful, slow, stubborn demand. During inflation, that kind of demand is what protects capital. Because when the market panics, people don't want to gamble. They want something boring, proven, and globally recognized. Sapphire is boring in the best possible way. So here's my question for you. If inflation stays high, would you rather hold an unheated sapphire or a bigger heated sapphire that looks better? Top 3, emerald, the green stone that trades like status currency. Emerald is the gemstone version of a luxury currency. And during inflation, luxury currencies don't disappear. They concentrate. Because when people lose trust in paper money, they don't just look for value. They look for status that survives the cycle. That's why emerald belongs in the top 3. Not because emerald is flawless. In fact, emerald is famous for the opposite. Emerald is full of inclusions. What the industry politely calls jardin, the garden inside the stone. And here's the strange financial truth. Those imperfections don't always hurt emerald. Sometimes they prove it, because emerald is one of the few gemstones where the market has accepted that perfection is suspicious. In inflation, that's a powerful advantage, because inflation doesn't just raise prices, it raises skepticism. Buyers start asking, what's been treated? What's been enhanced? What's being hidden? And emerald is a stone where transparency, ironically, matters more than clarity. Now, emerald is also one of the most treatment-sensitive gemstones on Earth. Most emeralds are oiled. That's not automatically fraud. Minor oil is widely accepted, but heavy oiling, resin filling, or aggressive enhancement changes the stone's resale behavior completely. So when we talk about emerald as an inflation asset, we're not talking about green stones. We're talking about a very specific category, Colombian emerald, minor oil, certified. Because Colombia isn't just geography, it's market authority. A Colombian origin report can change demand instantly, especially in the US, Europe, and high-end Asian markets. Now let's talk about what emerald does better than almost any gemstone. It signals wealth immediately. A sapphire can be confused with other blue stones. A ruby can be argued over. But a strong emerald green has an unmistakable psychological impact. In inflation, that impact becomes valuable because people buy what feels like real money. Now, the most liquid emerald shapes are emerald cut for obvious reasons, oval, cushion. Emerald cut is the most iconic, but it also exposes inclusions more brutally. So the best stones balance cut, color, and transparency. Now pricing. Commercial emerald can be cheap, but top-tier emerald is a different world, as you can see. $500 to $2,000 per carat for smaller stones with decent color, $3,000 to $12,000 per carat for strong green with certification, $15,000 to $50,000 plus per carat for top Colombian stones, minor oil, larger sizes. And in inflation, those high-grade emeralds behave like a portable luxury reserve because the buyers are not casual jewelry shoppers. They're capital holders. Now here's the most important financial point. Emerald isn't valued because it's the hardest gemstone. It isn't. Emerald isn't valued because it's the cleanest. It isn't. Emerald is valued because the world has collectively agreed that emerald green equals power, and in inflation, power holds value. So here's my question for you. If you were trying to store value, would you trust an emerald, knowing how common treatments are? Or would you rather choose a stone with less enhancement risk? And in 2026, which gemstone do you think will be the safest place for cash? Top 2, ruby, when scarcity becomes a price weapon. Ruby is not just a gemstone. Ruby is what happens when money tries to become blood. And during inflation, that symbolism becomes financially real. Because inflation doesn't only destroy purchasing power, it destroys patience. When people feel the value of cash slipping, they stop thinking like savers. They start thinking like survivors. And in that psychological shift, ruby becomes one of the most aggressively desired assets in the gemstone world. Here's why. Ruby sits at the intersection of 3 forces that inflation amplifies: scarcity, status, and liquidity. First, scarcity. Fine ruby is genuinely rare. Not marketing rare, real rare. A strong red ruby with high transparency, minimal inclusions, and good size is one of the hardest combinations in gem trading. And when something is truly scarce, inflation does something brutal. It turns scarcity into a price weapon. Second, status. Ruby has a global reputation that is almost irrational. In many markets, ruby is not treated as a colored stone. It's treated as a social declaration. And during inflation, social declarations don't weaken. They become louder because uncertainty makes people crave proof of stability. Ruby is proof. Third, liquidity. This is what separates ruby from hundreds of other beautiful stones. If you own a fine ruby, you don't need to convince the market that it matters. The market already knows. Now, the most important phrase in ruby valuation is no heat. Heating is common. It can improve color and clarity, and it's often accepted. But in inflation, the market becomes conservative. Buyers don't want improved. They want original. No heat ruby becomes the gemstone equivalent of a rare coin that was never cleaned. Not necessarily prettier, but more defensible. Now let's talk about color, because ruby is not red. Ruby is a spectrum. The most valuable rubies sit in that zone collectors call vivid red, strong saturation, minimal brown, minimal purple, and high internal glow. The classic term is pigeon blood, but the real point is simple. The best rubies don't look like paint. They look like they're lit from inside. Now shapes. The most liquid ruby cuts are oval, cushion, and sometimes round. Why? Because these shapes preserve weight, preserve color depth, and match high jewelry settings. Now pricing, and this is where ruby becomes a financial phenomenon. Commercial ruby can be $200 to $800 per carat. Fine heated ruby can climb into $2,000 to $10,000 per carat. But fine no-heat ruby, strong red, good clarity, certified, can jump to $20,000 to $100,000 plus per carat. And in exceptional stones, it goes beyond that. So why does ruby perform during inflation? Because ruby is not priced like a product. It's priced like a trophy. And trophies don't follow normal logic when money loses meaning. Here's the financial conclusion. During inflation, cash becomes fragile, and ruby becomes a form of compact certainty, a small object the world already respects. Now, I'll end with a question I want you to answer honestly. If you had to protect value for 12 months, would you trust a no-heat ruby? Or would you rather hold sapphire because it feels more stable? Top 1. Paraiba Tourmaline, the neon gem that outruns logic. Paraiba Tourmaline is what happens when inflation meets obsession. Because if ruby is a trophy, Paraiba is a phenomenon. And in inflation, phenomena can outperform fundamentals. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The most valuable assets during inflation are not always the oldest, not always the most traditional, and not always the most logical. Sometimes the winners are the assets that the market becomes emotionally addicted to. That's Paraiba. Paraiba isn't number one because it's the hardest gemstone. It isn't. It isn't number one because it has the cleanest resale structure. It doesn't. Paraiba is number one because it has something that inflation amplifies, an unmistakable visual signature. That electric neon blue, that greenish glow, that lit from inside color that looks unnatural, even though it's real. In finance, we talk about pricing power, the ability of an asset to hold price even when conditions get worse. Paraiba has pricing power because it doesn't compete with other gemstones. Ruby competes with ruby. Sapphire competes with sapphire. Emerald competes with emerald. But Paraiba competes with nothing. There is no substitute. And in inflation, the absence of substitutes is a weapon. Now let's talk about why Paraiba behaves like a high-performing inflation asset. First, true scarcity. Copper-bearing Paraiba quality tourmaline is extremely limited, especially in fine color, high clarity, and meaningful sizes. Most stones are small. Most stones are included. Most stones don't have the full neon effect. So when a stone appears that does, buyers don't negotiate the way they negotiate other gems. They chase it. Second, global demand concentration. Paraiba is not a local stone. It has strong demand in the US, Japan, Europe, the Middle East, and increasingly in high-end Asian luxury markets. That matters because inflation creates regional stress. A gemstone with only one buyer region is fragile. A gemstone with multiple buyer regions is resilient. Third, the psychology of modern wealth. Ruby is old power, emerald is legacy power, sapphire is institutional power, Paraiba is modern power. It's the gemstone that signals, I don't just have money, I have access. And in inflation, access is the new status. Now cuts and shapes. The most liquid Paraiba shapes are oval, cushion, pear. Why? Because Paraiba's value is in color, not symmetry. These shapes maximize face-up color, and they preserve weight in the rough. Now pricing, and this is why Paraiba sits at number one. Commercial tourmaline can be cheap, but true copper-bearing Paraiba quality stones are a different species. You can see $5,000 to $15,000 per carat for smaller stones with good neon, $20,000 to $60,000 per carat for high-quality, certified stones, $80,000 to $150,000 plus per carat for exceptional material in larger sizes. And the reason those prices survive inflation is simple. Paraiba isn't priced like a gemstone. It's priced like a rare signal. And signals hold value when currencies lose credibility. So here's my final question. and I want you to answer it seriously. In 2026, which gemstone do you think will be the safest place for cash? The traditional big three, or a modern phenomenon like Paraiba? So that's the full list. 10 gemstones that didn't just survive inflation. They gained value because cash lost trust. But here's what I want you to remember. This video isn't telling you to run out and buy gemstones. It's telling you that during inflation, the market doesn't reward emotions. It rewards liquidity, proof, and trust. And the difference between a smart purchase and a costly mistake is usually one detail most people ignore: treatments, certification, origin, and resale demand. Now I want to hear your opinion. In 2026, which gemstone do you think will be the safest place for cash? Do you trust the traditional big three, or do you think modern phenomena like Paraiba will keep winning? Drop your answer in the comments. I read them all. And if you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to subscribe, because the next videos go even deeper into the gemstone market and the hidden forces that move prices. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.